Accepting your partner's influence communicates to them that you care and respect them. It means that you're a team and that you're in this together. You are a we rather than an I.
Yes. And all relationships have power dynamics, but that doesn't mean there needs to be a power struggle. Power struggles in relationships usually result in one of two things, either a breaking point and the eventual deterioration of the relationship, or a turning point moment where you mature and grow. The latter is going to be our focus for today in this episode of Master Your Marriage. Welcome back to another episode. If this is your first time joining the show, welcome.
Welcome.
We thank you for being here every week. Make sure that while you're here, you hit that subscribe button because we do drop a new episode every Wednesday and you won't want to miss it. Well, I'm pretty excited about today's episode. This is a really important topic that we're talking about today, and we're talking about power struggles.
Power struggles. Okay. Yeah. So, and as Charlotte mentioned, they do happen in every relationship, but a secure relationship has this sort of balance of power. And this is why the term accepting influence is one of the cornerstones of a very healthy relationship. In this episode, we're going to discuss, one, the theory of accepting influence, two, real life examples of accepting and maybe refusing influence, and three, how you can become more accepting of your partner's influence in your relationship.
Excellent. So maybe we start today with a really big why.
Got to have a why. If I don't hear a why, sometimes I don't pay attention.
Me too.
Yeah.
So why should you care and why should you learn to accept influence? Well, the research is pretty clear and it shows that there's a strong correlation between accepting influence from your partner and both the level of happiness and the life expectancy of your relationship.
Yeah, not only life expectancy in your relationship, but life expectancy overall.
That's true too.
Yeah, happy people live longer.
Yep, happy marriages have healthier people.
Yeah, without a doubt. And in fact, one of the 8 predictors of divorce, as discovered by Dr. John Gottman in his research, is a failure to accept influence. Dr. John Gottman reports that 81% of couples who don't accept influence, so in 81%, if they don't accept influence, they'll eventually split up. And as you might remember from Dr. Gottman's research, we're now able to predict whether couples will stay together or break up with a 94% accuracy. So this means that it's pretty important to have this quality of accepting influence in your relationship.
Super important. And of course, even if the couple isn't part of the 81% that end up eventually splitting up, if they do stay together and they're struggling to accept influence, they're still not going to be happy. In fact, they're probably going to be quite miserable in this combative relationship that's going to be filled with lots of criticism and lots of defensiveness.
Yeah. And how's that supposed to make you feel, right? And we know that happiness in your relationship has this trickle down effect into every part of your life. So if you're miserable in your relationship, probably going to be miserable at work. And this is not going to be good for your overall success, your happiness, or your health.
That's right. So that is a pretty big why.
Yeah, I'm sold. I want to dig into it now.
Okay, good. So
okay. Good thing we talked me into it.
Good. So what does it even mean? What does it mean to accept influence? Well, accepting influence means that you're taking your partner's opinion into account and being open to using his or her input to decide together on what to do as a couple.
Yeah. I like to use the example of in a relationship where we consider each other's opinions, that even if I know what I'm going to do, I've sort of made this decision. I think this is going to be the best avenue. Do I then seek Charlotte's opinion and gain her input? And am I grown up enough? Am I emotionally intelligent enough to maybe change my perspective based on her input, even though I already thought I knew what I was going to do? And I think that's where the growing comes from. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So in these important decisions, it doesn't mean that you resentfully accommodate your spouse, nor does it mean that you force your ideas on them. Accepting influence just says that we're open, right? And we're open to taking our partner's opinion into account. And that's fair, right? Something that is important to both of your relationship. You should have a say in it, or at least some input, right? Or at least feel like you have a say.
Right. Because otherwise what ends up happening is one person is feeling like their autonomy and probably their spirit is being crushed.
Yeah. Just stepped on.
Right. So even though this, as you listen to us talk about this, you're probably thinking, well, that's common sense. But even though it's common sense, it's not so easy to do sometimes. So why is it so challenging for people to accept influence?
Well, I
mean, this is a big deal. 81% of marriages end up in divorce if they're not accepting influence. So this is, yes, logical. Yes, common sense. Yes, we all get it. But why is it so freaking hard?
I think because common sense isn't as common as we think it is.
Well, there's that.
We'll start there. And I think another piece is maybe our culture here in the Western US. We certainly have a culture, and more recently we have this divisive culture more than ever. And disagreeing with someone has become this threat.
It's a
right?
threat.
And a threat that's a lot like sort of meeting a bear on the trail when you're hiking. And if you were actually really to meet that bear, you'd have to do one of three things, right? You'd either grab your bear spray and maybe fight if you were stuck, or attempt to run away from the bear, or lock up and freeze, and then you'll be dinner.
Then we become dinner.
Yeah, then you become
right?
dinner.
So unfortunately, though, I love that analogy because we have really, truly got to the point where we perceive disagreement like it's this big old grizzly bear.
We don't know how to disagree in the Western culture.
And our reaction to that disagreement is that we, again, like the bear, either want to fight or flee or freeze in much the same way. Our brain is really today just can't differentiate between the stress of not getting our way or the stress of not being right in this disagreement versus it can't differentiate between that and the danger of being chased by a bear.
Yeah. Since when did a disagreement push us into fight, flight, or freeze?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So when we get into disagreement, according to Daniel Coleman, we move into something called the amygdala hijack, where the feeling part of our brain limits access to our prefrontal cortex, or our reasoning axis of our brain. So in other words, when disagreements arise, we actually stop thinking logically and clearly. We don't have the ability to access our prefrontal cortex.
Right. And our inability to disagree or tolerate any disagreement with another person is a problem that, as Robert just mentioned, societally seems to be getting worse.
Yeah,
not
absolutely,
better.
Yeah.
And so when we hear the words, I kind of have a different perspective here. I have, I don't really think I agree with you. Our brain is screaming like, bear run, fight, and then we are interpreting that and we're creating meaning from that. And we're hearing things like, you're an idiot. You're so stupid. How could you think that way? When simply all a person has done has just expressed a different opinion.
Yeah, a different point of view.
Yeah. And they didn't say you're an idiot, but that's what we hear.
Yeah. And I think we're conditioned to that. But if you listen to any of our other episodes, you'll know that this is not the case in all cultures. In some cultures, disagreement is considered a very productive and even good. This is because conflict is good. It's a gift. It's something that can compel us to become more emotionally intelligent and help deepen our love and our understanding for the other person.
Yeah, it really is. I love what Dr. John Gottman actually says about conflict. He says that it's the way it's like the whetstone that we use to sharpen our love and understanding for each other.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah,
that's good.
So in coaching, we actually, this is one of the things we work with couples on. We teach couples how to manage conflict. We have this skill set that we teach them in coaching and in our retreats. And we teach them how to find compromise and how to find win-win solutions. But none of that is really possible without the ability to accept influence.
Yeah. And there, of course, is a bit of a gender gap when it comes to accepting influence.
No, this is interesting. What is that gender gap?
Well, so the research suggests, and maybe there would be some newer research, but right now the research suggests that it's harder for men to accept influence than it is for women. More specifically, heterosexual men tend to have a harder time sharing this power and sharing influence.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this a lot. It would be interesting as things change societally, to see when that kind of tips the other direction. But up to this point, the research has suggested that women do a little bit better job at accepting influence than men. And we're not here to bash men. We're just kind of here to talk about the science and to talk about the research. And
maybe I'm just on the men's side saying like, maybe we're not as bad as the research shows, but I think we can be.
I still talk to women all the time today. In fact, where, her husband really did struggle to accept her influence, and she tried to share her needs with him and he shut her down. So, I know that is still the case, but at the same time, there's certainly more and more women who are also asserting their power and trying to find their voice and try to find their power. And the way they think they need to do that is by shutting down their husband, their partner, and to not accept their partner's influence. And so as I look back at us, just to sort of play the other side of the research, I think in our relationship, it was completely the opposite. Like, you were really the one who was better naturally, probably had a little bit more emotional intelligence at the beginning of our relationship. You were more the one who was, able to accept influence. I struggled with that a lot. I think that for the first half of my life, my goal maybe not the first half, but maybe close. I think my goal in disagreements was to prove that I was right, which is a horrible goal.
Yeah. And that sounds familiar from my experience.
First few years of marriage.
Early on experiences. Yeah. Yes.
And I look back and I realized that the reason that I was this way, as I remember it, is that I was totally focused on me in those conversations. I wasn't looking at the situation from your perspective. And I think when any of us do that, the goal of every disagreement becomes one thing, and that's to win.
Yeah.
Right? To be right. A zero-sum game rules. And zero-sum game just means there's only one winner. There's only one loser. And of course, in those conversations, I wanted to be the winner. So of course, this was what was happening in these moments, because I had this mindset, was my amygdala was being hijacked.
Yep.
Just like you said earlier. My prefrontal cortex took a nap, and that would mean that I would end up saying really hurtful, really mean things. And then later, once I calm down, regret them.
Yeah, without a doubt. And so what does it look like when we're not accepting influence? So there's two basic ways that we can reject our partner's influence, right? So let's cover those. One is to flat out say like, nope, I don't want any part of this conversation. I think your perspective is not valid. That's a zero-sum game. And I'm right, you're wrong. This conversation is over.
Right. That's just flat out rejecting.
Yeah, that's
influence.
Rejecting. The second way is by sort of faking influence. This means I might pacify you in this example and say, sure, that's a good idea. I'll actually try to do better at picking my socks up, but I don't really intend to do any of that. And so that's not sincere. It's just a way to kind of flee this conversation and flee the bear that's sort of fueling this disagreement. And since disagreements are bad in our culture, we just avoid it by placating.
So in that case, the faking acceptance of influence.
Like, sure, I'll do that. Yeah. When you have no intention of doing it.
That's the equivalent of running from the bear.
And just running away from that conversation.
And one of the most important things I think to realize about accepting influence is, because I think people get hung up on this, is that it's not the same as giving away power.
Yeah.
Or
I think people feel that though, right?
They do. Because again, they're in their feeling part of their brain. They're in their amygdala. So they feel like they're giving away their power, or they're placating their needs, or they're having to give up their identity, a part of who they are.
Yeah.
But those of you who are men who are listening to this, where we talked about this gender difference, honestly, that would be a huge turnoff for secure women. I think that when women have secure attachment, they don't want you to be a weak man. They don't want you to placate your opinions. They don't want you to just accept everything that we say. I think they would be very turned off by that. They don't want you to relinquish your power. They want you to lead. They need you to lead.
Yeah.
It's just that accepting influence is about moving away from a position of me to a place of we, which requires us to develop maturity and to be able to see the world a lot less binary.
Yeah. No right or wrong, win, lose, those types of
Black
things.
and white.
Yeah.
Yeah. We need to be able to see things,
My way or the highway.
Yeah. Not that way.
Yeah. Not
Right.
that way.
Right.
And the research supports this and shows that we cannot be powerful or influential in our relationships unless we're also willing to be influenced.
Yes.
Contrary to what our amygdala might tell us in that situation, accepting your partner's influence is the best way to acquire more respect, more power, and more influence in your relationship. Sort of counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah, I love that. To be able to be powerful in your relationship, you actually have to be able to be influenced.
You have to give up power.
You do.
Yeah.
It's
If that's where we feel the power is. If the power is being right, then you need to give up that in order.
And this is also what we're talking about. This is how you develop greater emotional intelligence. It's how we if we're accepting influence, we have to then develop and grow, mature, but it's also going to provide us with greater happiness and satisfaction. And it's going to help us to develop a more secure attachment in our relationship.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you might hear couples say to each other when they're, maybe accepting one another's influence?
Yeah.
Let's say they're disagreeing over parenting, which seems to be our most recent one, right? How to handle a child who broke curfew. What types of language do you think we might hear from an emotionally intelligent couple in this conversation? We're going to use the breaking curfew and parenting as an example.
So I think,
how's the language? What does that look like? So you guys can write this down or maybe take some notes.
So I think things that you would hear in this conversation are things like, what is important to you, Robert? Help me understand your perspective.
Yeah.
Help me understand your position here. What are some of your concerns? You might hear me saying to him, I agree with part of what you're saying, and I also want to contribute this.
Right.
Right. Yeah. You might hear me say, I think your point of view makes a lot of sense. And have you considered this? Right. What are some other things you might hear?
Well, some of the other things might be can we find some common ground? Let's compromise here. One of my favorite ones is like, I never really thought of things that way. You're actually starting to bring me around. You're starting to influence me a little bit. Mm-hmm. And let's agree to include both of our views in this situation.
Yeah. And include both of our point of views in whatever compromise or solution we come up with.
Yeah. And that's one of the things we talk a lot about, like in our coaching, in our retreats. And it's really how do we do compromise? Mm-hmm. How do we have constructive disagreements? Where
we still find win-wins so that because if one person is always winning and the other person is always losing,
then
you're not
somebody's
winning.
Always losing.
You're not winning.
Yeah.
And you're not
winning at all. Yeah.
So maybe you're thinking to yourself right now, you heard us just kind of demo some of these words, this language that you might be hearing. And of course, your logic brain, your prefrontal cortex is like, that's awesome. I love all that. I love that language. But then how the heck do I actually implement any of that if I keep going into this amygdala hijack?
That's tough. Yeah.
Right. So you're going to need to mentally prepare yourself for disagreement. Okay. Whatever that disagreement is, small, large conflict, you're going to need to mentally prepare yourself. And so and the thing is, you're not going to have a couple hours generally to go say, hey, oh gosh, our kid just broke curfew. So, can you give me like 2-3 hours so I can go in the other room and maybe come up with a good paragraph or something that I can read to you in this situation, right? You're not going to get that. You're going to need to prepare yourself now so that you can think about a couple of key things when you start to go into disagreement.
Yeah. And I think these are the guiding, maybe an overarching sort of themes when you're going into disagreement. And if you find yourself, if this episode's resonating with you and you find yourself where you're having a lot of disagreements and you're saying, okay, I need to get better at that. If this is something that you want to work on for the health of your relationship, then you're going to need to just sort of incorporate these next steps, right? And so here are 3 quick steps to prepare yourself for disagreement. And you can do this in 30 seconds. And as a bonus, by the way, you can apply this to any relationship, not just your marriage. So here they are.
Okay. So first, before you even start having this conversation is to remind yourself, as you're doing this quick little 30-second reboot before you go in there, remind yourself to see the other person's perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah.
If you remember back when I was sharing my personal experience, I said that my biggest problem was that I saw every conflict as binary, win or lose. So before you go into these conversations, remind yourself, be curious, be open to his perspective. Remember that if one partner wins, then they're both losing. So and another thing Robert and I have come up with that I think is, we joke about this sometimes when we're driving, and we have an example of this we'll share. But if I find myself judging him harshly in my mind and thinking, what a jerk.
Yeah.
How could he think that way? What an idiot, whatever it is. I like to remind myself, this is an interpretation of something. So what is the most generous interpretation I could actually give him in this situation? Because maybe my interpretation is actually being hijacked right now.
Yeah. And I think, and it's easy, especially if maybe you're a little stressed or you're in a hurry. And I like this, the driving example. Is that the one you want to talk about?
You can share that.
Yeah. So, and I love that, always assume good intent. And I think if you move into that from assuming good intent, that people didn't necessarily mean to, do that bad thing to you. And so again, that's Hallen's razor that we talked about a couple of episodes ago. Mm-hmm. But, if somebody cuts you off and they take your lane and then they speed up, you can either get frustrated, or what I like to say is maybe they got to pee.
Yeah.
Right. And think about the grace that you would extend somebody. If that was your friend and they called you, they said, dude, I need your lane. I got to get off the freeway because I have to go to the bathroom really bad. You'd be like, yeah, go.
Yeah.
It changes the perspective. So for us, it was like, oh yeah, he had to pee. We're great.
And we do that all the time in the car when someone's a jerk on the road, right? It's like, oh, they probably have to pee.
Yeah.
That's our little thing we say back and forth to each other. And it's so interesting because I could be raging over that, or I can just laugh about it.
Yeah.
So always assume the best and ask, what is the most generous interpretation I could give you in this situation?
Yeah, instead of a hard line interpretation. I like that. Right.
So what's the second thing?
The second thing to think about before any disagreement begins is, what is your goal for the conversation here? What's the goal here? Is your goal to preserve the relationship?
Mm-hmm.
In this disagreement, are we looking to still stay together at the end?
Right.
That's or if important. My goal is to end this relationship, then, clearly just keep going with what you're doing.
You should keep on doing what you've always done.
Right. But if your goal is to stay together and build a stronger relationship, then you need to figure out how to create a win-win.
Right.
Right. And if I enter the discussion or this disagreement with the end goal, how do I find a win? Mm-hmm. How do I find a compromise that serves both parties best? How do I do this as gently as possible? How do I give as much grace? How do I assume good intent? If I move into that with the goal, this overarching goal, we talked about these three things are the kind of this canopy that overrides this disagreement, then that's second step of what is my outcome that I want?
Yep. Yeah. Yep. And then have that goal in mind.
Yeah. As you go through it.
Before you even start.
Yeah.
Right. And then the third thing that we would say as you're mentally 30-second preparing yourself, the third thing is to keep reminding and asking yourself, what are we really disagreeing about here? Because we get so caught up in sometimes the nitty gritty little things that aren't really what it's about. And when we do that, we tend to make it personal. And we take it as a personal attack, but it's not. And what we know from the research is that we usually aren't disagreeing about what we think we're disagreeing about. We're really disagreeing about dreams, core values that we each have, about our things that go core to our personal identity. So when we can stay curious about each other's goals and dreams and values, then we can start to see their perspective more easily, which goes back to number one. The first thing we said is, can I stay curious about their perspective? And if we can do that, then of course we can find these win-win solutions that will incorporate both partners' needs and allow us to accept that influence from each other, so we can find, okay, I'm going to take your influence and you're going to accept my influence, and we're going to find a solution that honors both of our positions.
So we talked about three things. Can you recap those three things for me?
Okay, what were they?
I know, because we talked about a lot of stuff.
Number one is we're going to have an open mind, right? We're going to try to go, okay, I can't just focus on me here. I need to consider your perspective.
Right. Number two is Always assume good intent.
Always assume good intent.
Yeah.
Right. And then say, well, what is my
What's
goal?
the goal?
What is my goal?
Assume good intent. Keep the goal in mind for your relationship.
And
because
then
this is just one discussion in the relationship.
Yeah. And remember that we're not usually fighting about what we're fighting about.
Yeah. And that's the third one.
Right.
Which I always say that disagreements really are a values mismatch problem, but
values, or we think it's a problem, but it's usually not, because yes, we both have values and our values can be different, but it's not necessarily a problem if you can talk about the values that are behind the disagreement and find a solution that incorporates everyone's.
Which is why those 10 questions are so important.
Yeah.
Because they'll dig into that.
Okay.
The more we do this, the more we incorporate these strategies and the better we get at doing it, the easier these conversations will be.
Yes.
And it can be a little uncomfortable at first.
Everything is.
Anytime we do, as we've said, anytime you do something new, you generally suck at it, right?
Right.
But it can make it less uncomfortable as you're practiced at doing it.
Yes, practice.
Right? And practice on the easy disagreements, by the way.
Yeah.
What do you want for lunch?
Mm-hmm.
See, that's easy. What's our goal? Let's get lunch.
Yeah. And by the way, these steps that we shared with you guys today, this is how you get out of amygdala hijack.
Yeah.
We started with how we see disagreement as a bear. We're hiking and we see a bear and we want to fight or freeze or flee. And how we get out of that amygdala hijack is by starting to observe our behaviors and analyze these things that we talked about today. And that forces us to start using our prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
And that's what allows us to act with agency rather than living life on this autopilot where we just are run by our reactions.
Yeah, this reactive mode that we're in. Yeah.
So the more we can evaluate, the more we're able to interrupt these automatic behaviors, and the more we're able to force, again, that prefrontal cortex to make good decisions that are actually good for our relationship. And of course, if it's good for our relationship, that's going to trickle down into everything in our life. And that's really, what we believe is relationships give us life.
Yeah. Happy and healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we wrap up today's show, we just want to say how grateful we are for you and your support. And as you know, the algorithm depends on your ratings and reviews. So if you could help us reach a bigger audience, that would be so appreciated. If you haven't yet, would you please just leave us a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on.
And more importantly, as always, if there's someone else in your life that needs help in their relationship, you feel like they would benefit from this episode or any of our previous episodes, would you do us a favor and kindly share our channel with them?
And always, be kind to each other this week. Take care of each other. Remember, it's the small things done often that make the biggest impact.
Until next time.